From buses to trucks, Tata Motors lands 3,400 electron-volt orders across segments. That single number resets the trending playbook. The key question is not what happened, but what changes next for operators and users. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. Tata Motors just crossed a threshold that most analysts didn't expect to see this fast. Here's what actually happened. Across buses, trucks, and commercial vehicles, Tata Motors secured 3,400 electron-volt orders. That's not a pilot. That's not a test market. That's a commercial-scale signal that India's transport sector is shifting, and it's happening right now. But the headline number is only half the story. What matters more is where these orders are coming from and what they signal about the economics of electric transport in India. Let's break this down. The bus segment alone represents a massive opportunity. India's public transport system moves millions of people daily, and diesel buses dominate that space. The operating cost of an electric bus is dramatically lower than diesel, fuel costs drop by 60 to 70%, maintenance expenses shrink because electric powertrains have fewer moving parts, and battery technology has matured enough that long-distance routes are now viable. Tata Motors bus orders aren't coming from small municipalities experimenting with one or two vehicles. They're coming from state transport corporations and large fleet operators who've done the math and concluded that electric makes financial sense right now, not in 5 years. The truck segment is where this gets really interesting. Trucks are the backbone of India's logistics network. A single truck can clock 200,000 kilometers a year, sometimes more. Traditionally, electrifying trucks was considered a problem for 2030 or 2035. But Tata Motors is landing orders today. Why? Because the total cost of ownership has crossed a psychological threshold. A fleet operator running 50 trucks has done the calculation: electric vehicles cost more upfront, but the per kilometer operating expense is so much lower that the payback period is now under 5 years. When the payback is under 5 years, you don't wait for subsidies or mandates, you buy now, because you want to capture the savings before your competitor does. This matters for 3 specific groups. First, fleet operators and logistics companies. Your competitive advantage just shifted from fuel hedging to battery management. Second, power infrastructure companies. This surge in commercial EV adoption means grid demand in logistics hubs is about to spike. Third, traditional automakers who've been slow-walking their EV transition. They just watched Tata Motors move 3,400 units across multiple segments in what's likely a compressed timeframe. That's velocity they can't ignore. Here's the contrarian angle that nobody's talking about yet. These 3,400 orders will strain India's charging infrastructure. The grid can handle it, but the distribution of charging points is about to become a competitive advantage. Companies that control charging networks, parking depots, fleet terminals, highway corridors, have just become strategically important real estate. This isn't about Tesla superchargers on highways. This is about who controls the charging at a transport company's depot in Bangalore or Mumbai. That's where the real margin is. The global systems implication is equally important. India's commercial EV adoption is now faster than most developed markets achieved at the same scale point. This proves that the transition doesn't require perfect battery technology or abundant charging stations. It requires only thing: economics. When the math works, adoption accelerates. India's lower labor costs, higher fuel prices, and pressure to reduce import dependency on oil create a different incentive structure than Western markets. The EV transition in India isn't following the playbook written in Germany or California. It's writing its own. Watch these metrics over the next 90 days. First, delivery velocity. How many of these 3,400 orders actually convert to vehicles on road in the next quarter? Second, fleet operator profitability reports. Do the real-world operating costs match the projections that drove these orders? Third, charging infrastructure announcements. Which companies are positioning themselves to capture the charging network opportunity? This is significant because it resets the timeline for India's commercial vehicle electrification. We're not watching a gradual transition anymore. We're watching the moment when the economics flipped, and now the market is moving faster than policy. That's worth paying attention to. What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next? What's the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next?